So hello everyone, welcome to the new seminar of Koç University Center for Asian Studies seminar series. Today we are happy to host Fuat Kına. Fuat got his BA degree from the Department of Economics at Boğaziçi University and received his master's degree from the Department of Sociology at Şehir University, Istanbul Şehir University. He is currently a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Sociology at Koç University. Fuat, published several papers. A recent paper with Erdem Yörük and Ali Barbu, published in Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. And then he also published a chapter, again co-authored with Erdem Yörük, in the Handbook on Austerity, Populism, and the Welfare State. He worked in several research projects, including Emerging Markets Welfare ERC project, and he's currently working in a Politus ERC project. So welcome, Fuat, and the floor is yours.
I just turned on my microphone and
can you hear Fuat right now?
Can you hear me? Ses deneme. Okay. So the title of my talk is Mobilization-Policy Nexus, the Maoist Insurgency and National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, which is a part of my doctoral dissertation. In my doctoral dissertation, I compare Brazil and India, the relationships between mobilizations of two giant, radical, massive social movements, the MST and the Naxalite movement, and two social assistance programs, Bolsa Familia and NREGA, respectively. And Brazil part is now an under review paper at one of top journals, sociology journals, co-authored by Burak Hoca and Erdem Hoca, my thesis advisors, and we got revised and resubmit twice from the same journal. And nowadays we are trying to resubmit our second revision. And today I'm going to present the Indian case in my doctoral dissertation, which is still under construction. So I do really appreciate if you give me some feedback, and your responses and criticisms are very valuable for me. And this is the abstract of my paper. So I analyzed the relationship between the Maoist Naxalite movement, which is a massive revolutionary movement in rural India, and the NREGA, social assistance program, which is an employment-based guarantee scheme, and also known as one of the largest social assistance programs in the world. And my first argument is that Indian government employed this program as a counter-insurgency tool, disproportionately targeting the districts with higher levels of Naxalite mobilization. So the government's aim was to demobilize the radical activism of the rural poor. However, I also claim that this strategy has been failed, and the Maoists have reversed this impact of the government policy, and the NREGA unintendedly increased the mobilization of the Naxalites. And this is unintended for the government, but pretty strategic, a result of a strategic move of the Naxalites. I argue that the Maoists effectively framed the program as a collective action demand, and by doing so, they transformed political containment into a concession from the government to mobilization. Let me briefly summarize the literature and theoretical framework of my paper. First, let me start with the substitution thesis. I conceptualized and empirically showed the details of the substitution thesis in Brazil paper. And Social movement scholars describe the government responses against social movement mobilization on a dichotomy ranges from repression to concession. So government have two options, either sending police forces and some other brutal solutions, or giving some concessions that exactly refers the actual demand of the movement. Substitution basically resembles concession, but has a very significant difference. It is based on a scenario where in the conflict between the government and mobilization, government systematically directs a policy to the mobilization other than what the movement demands. So it is another benevolent policy that deals with material grievances of the poor, but government implements this benevolent policy while systematically unmeeting the actual demand of the movement. And in this other paper on Brazil, we showed that Brazilian government demobilized the rural unrest raised by the MST movement by distributing more social assistance to the municipalities with higher levels of land invasions. Since both repression and concession, I mean, sending more police forces or giving land reforms, increase mobilization more and more. Therefore, we define substitution in that paper as a third governmental response in addition to repression and concession. And the reason for substitution is that concession has a considerable risk of escalating mobilization more and more, since it justifies prognostic frames of the movement, and success might increase, might circulate the collective desire for further success. But substitution mainly aims to dismantle this feeling of success to demobilize social movements. So the substitution framework has three components: social movement mobilization, the target, the demand of the movement, and the substitute policy, which is employed to demobilize the movement. And for the Indian case, the three components of substitution triangle are like that. So we have Naxalite movement mobilization as the radical mobilization of the rural poor. Second, so the movement mainly targets preventing land invasions, land dispossessions. So the main demand can be described as annihilation of or eradication of land dispossessions in rural India. This is how the Naxalites historically mobilized the rural poor. And since 2005, these land dispossessions have mostly been done under the special economic zone projects. And so it's a negative demand compared to the Brazilian case. The movement wants to prevent implementation of these projects to protect land rights of the poor. And third, as a substitute policy, the government social, we have the government social, the NREGA social assistance program. To better illustrate the difference between substitution and concession, I built up an analytical model on the policies, the benevolent policies that deal with material grievances. So the MP nexus basically depends on the idea that whether a policy is a substitute or is this a substitution or a concession is determined by the extent that movement demands that policy or makes claims on that policy or create a counter narrative, build a new discourse on that policy. So there is a continuity between from concession to substitution, while substitution demobilizes the movement as a governmental strategy. Concession inherently circulates this feeling of success and increases further mobilization of the movements. Y here stands for the mobilization and X stands for government policy. Y0 is 0 point mobilization of the movements. And I basically, by this analytical framework, argue that the mobilizational impact of a government policy is a function of demanding. So by demanding, I mean how much the movement construct a demanding discourse or demanding collective action frames on that policy. And DS in the figure shows the MP curve for substitution. And it has a negative slope since the movement doesn't make claims for that policy yet. And it is the most common case for social assistance program all around the world, since social movements very rarely demand social assistance programs. Social movements rarely demand social assistance programs. However, by making effective claims on that government policy, creating a demanding discourse on that policy, maybe blaming the authorities for the corruption or insufficient implementation of the policy, of the programs, movements, by doing so, can transform substitution to concession, for which we have a positive slope. And so that means it is prone to increase further mobilization of the movement. Therefore, the MP nexus briefly says that the mobilizational impact of a benevolent policy depends on movements' previous efforts to frame that policy as a collective action demand. What about the NREGA provision? So it guarantees 100 days of employment in public works for the rural unemployed. And it is still the largest social assistance program in the world. 126 million people benefited from the program in 2021. However, the vast majority of previous research examined its effectiveness, such that asking, how the program was successful to alleviate poverty and decrease the rate of unemployment, or increase women emancipation, living standards, wage levels, etc. And scholars very rarely worked on its determinants, and like all other social assistance programs, they investigated structural determinants and largely ignored the political dynamics behind the program. What about the Naxalite movement? So land conflict in rural India has an amazing history that rooted in colonial land tenure systems, which I will not be able to deepen in this talk, unfortunately. But the first emergence of the Maoist Naxalites was named after a series uprisings in the Naxalbari village in West Bengal state in 1967. So this unrest was shaped in the shadow of land-based giant, massive, enormous land-based grievances. And it is practically triggered by a collective demand for land reform. And I will just jump for 30 years due to some time limitations, but a critical turning point, which might be more important for us now. A critical turning point occurred in 2004 when the three powerful factions, different factions, People's War, Party Unity, and the Maoist Communist Center, merged together to create CPI Maoist, which is still the most prominent faction of the Naxalites. But the overall, not only the CPI Maoist, but the overall mobilization of different factions intensified between 2005 and 2010. And compared to other rural social movements in India, the Naxalites have historically focused on the most radical options throughout the land conflicts. That's why I picked the Naxalite movement in India. And the Prime Minister of India described the Maoist insurgency as the single biggest internal security challenge ever faced by the country in 2006. And since the implementation of the SEZ Act, Special Economic Zone Act, in 2005, the movement with all its factions concentrated on these project zones to mobilize their fight against class enemies of the rural poor. And so these are government official decision makers, landowner allies, and some other market-based allies, mostly came to the field with development projects. And Naxalites have various factions following different tactics, from armed militancy to parliamentary politics, and more than 100 front organizations, from student organizations to trade unions. However, the existing quantitative research on mobilization, analyzing mobilization of the Naxalites, often reduced movement to a single violent armed terrorist group, and neglect social movement dynamics in rural India. And the impact of the NREGA on Naxalites is not studied by social movement scholars, I mean, in a quantitative manner. And these quantitative research can be classified under security terror studies, and they often focused on tactics of official authorities to how to pacify these movements, how to demobilize the radicalism in rural India. And they, I think, missed very important mobilizational dynamics. That's what I argue in the paper. Here are my research questions and two hypotheses. Did the Indian government employ the NREGA to demobilize the radical mobilization of the rural poor? And if yes, how successful is this strategy in demobilizing the rural poor's radical activism? I basically expect to find the number of Naxalite-related events increase the number of the NREGA provisions, since I argue that the state governments, also the federal governments of India, used NREGA to demobilize the Naxalites. And second, I also expect to find that the NREGA has a mobilizing effect on the Naxalites, because the movement's organizers frame the NREGA as a collective action demand. And here is the design of the paper's rest. I constructed a novel panel dataset, district level, yearly based from 2006 to 2014. I used an original database of GLOCON, which is used for the first time in my research. And it's a global database on contentious political events, also an outcome of the ERC project led by Erdem Hoca, where I have worked as well. And you can find the details on the webpage. Among all contentious political events, I made a list of all factions and front organizations of the Naxalites and searched the list among the organizer categories of the events. So I didn't focus only on the keywords of Naxal and Maoist, or didn't filter violent events, or didn't count number of deaths as previous researchers often did. I mean, this terror and security studies often did. And for the empirical models, for both sides of interaction, I used IV2SLS model, instrumental variable analysis, following a quasi-experimental empirical design, because I had a very important, significant reverse causality problem. So I was looking for two-directional relationships. So I inherently accept that reverse causality as an empirical problem in my framework. So that's why I used the instrumental variable approach. I presented my results in the same order, provided relevant mechanisms for those. And in the mechanism section, I showed how the SEZ project mattered. These projects caused large land dispossessions for the rural poor in India and constitute the main material grievance, land-based material grievance that the Naxalites have mobilized for many decades. But in the substitution scenario, the Indian government prioritized the interests of their upper class allies through the development projects, and which was the traditional enemy of the rural movements and rural poor. This is how I argue that the substitution mechanism works in India. Further, I will also show some results of my qualitative analysis of the two mouthpieces of largest factions of the Naxalites. This is the list of front organizations that I cover while filtering Naxalite-related events in the GLOCON database. I collected all these names from either movements, manifestations, or legal documents, and some administrational security records. They all belong to 3-4 major factions of the Naxalites. And in GLOCON database, we extracted social movement data, protest data from 4 different sources, as you see. And general trend for different sources resemble each other very much. And instead of adding them all together, I picked the most common source to keep the consistency inside the data. The Hindu was what I picked, what I selected, especially after the merger of 3 factions in 2004, the creation of CPI Maoist, the mobilization of the different factions started to rise, and in the early 2010s, after the historical peak, the mobilization started to de-escalate, and the number of Naxalite events went down, but it still keeps, let's say, a standard level and still higher than previous levels. For the results, according to the instrumental variable analysis regressing the NREGA on relevant predictors, the percent change in the number of Naxalite events has increased the NREGA person days distributed by the government. The second model here includes additional control variables for a smaller time period, and the third model controls district level fixed effects, while other baseline models control state level fixed effects. And the fourth and fifth models consider the impact of spatial and temporal lags of dependent and independent variable of interest. And all of these 5 models say that Naxalite mobilization has a positive impact on the NREGA provision. But showing the causal relationship in a quantitative manner is not enough to understand the actual mechanism behind. So I run few additional analysis on secondary sources, on some qualitative materials, and also run some few more quantitative models. First, let me say that this disproportionate targeting in India is much more visible agenda for the government compared to other similar contexts like Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, China, etc. After the government implemented the program, so after government declared the initiation of the program, they developed an algorithm that detects the social need. So they decided on a constant number of districts to start that program. However, in the official documents, 32 more districts are manually added to this list, and those districts are labeled in the official documents as Naxal affected districts. And second, I noticed and argue that although the strategy is invented by the federal government, it is actually implemented by state level leading political authorities from 3 groups of parties. I found some evidence that these three blocks, I mean CPI, the mainstream Communist Party of India, the traditional communist bloc, BJP, the far-right bloc, and INC, National Congress, all have separately made claims on the program, on the NREGA program, and avoid from to be associated with the SEZ projects. And that all three blocks implemented this containment strategy. So this strategy is invented by the federal government, but implemented and carried out by the state governments. And this governmental strategy includes further the implementation of SEZ projects as well. The government employs the NREGA and land dispossessions at the same time. This is how the actual demand of the rural poor is substituted with the program. I tested this by additional models and showed that the government distributed more NREGA provisions when these districts experienced higher level of land dispossessions under the projects. This relationships defines the substitution scenario, which is actually a specific version of political containment here. And in substitution, not only the mobilization is targeted, but also land-based rights and claims of the rural poor is targeted and substituted with social assistance, by social assistance. And for the Naxalite models, for the second hypothesis, these are logistic regression models having a panel data structure again, with temporal and spatiotemporal lags and with famous control variables in the previous quant literature. And when we look at the impact of the NREGA provision on the Naxalite mobilization, we see that as either the expenditure or coverage versions of the NREGA variable, or numbers in the target district, or as a spillover from neighboring districts, the NREGA increases the number of Naxalite-related events. Why and how does the NREGA mobilize the Naxalites? If you are interested in social movement mobilization like me, I think this is the most interesting question. This might be the most interesting question for you in that research. At least it is for me. So to understand the mechanism of this mobilizing impact of the NREGA, I started to investigate how these different factions of the movement approach the program. And I qualitatively analyzed two mouthpieces of two large factions, which are respectively representing the armed militancy and parliamentary politics. These are CPI Maoist and CPI ML Liberation factions. And the journals are People's March and Liberation journals. I have noticed that the movements are very proactive while building their discourse on the program, and which reminded me the framing discourse in the social movement literature. And it wasn't like the MST in the Brazilian case. So the MST organizers often used a negative discourse on the Bolsa Familia program and insisted on their historical demand for land reforms. But these two giant factions in India asked more and more NREGA for the rural poor, which was quite interesting for me when I first encountered. They still blamed the government, but this time not for implementing social assistance, but implementing insufficient level of social assistance. Then I noticed that this is very convenient with the findings of some anthropological research, field research, that argue the Naxalites are very flexible in their everyday relationship with the potential adherences with the rural poor. They are much more flexible than their official documents, they say. And finally, I came to the conclusion that the Naxalites transformed the NREGA from a substitution to a concession, and then having more provisions, gaining more person days, became a concession and provided credits for the movement, not for the government. Let me briefly show some evidence on these journals. This is from Liberation Journal, and in 2007, just 2 years after the implementation, first announcement of the program, they officially decided to raise a grassroots demand for the program. And although the People's March, CPI Maoist, is a little more reserved against the NREGA, they have frequently implied this substitution strategy and again criticized insufficient implementation. And what is more, Alfa Shah, who is an anthropologist, lived in guerrilla zones more than 1 year. In her field research tells that the Maoists prepared banners with the rural poor. For example, they referred 1 year employment instead of 100 days under the NREGA program. And in some other articles, she talks about the NREGA march organized by the Maoist, CPI Maoist group, and similar issues raised by the movement. And also CPI Maoist explicitly implied that they are much aware of the fact that the NREGA is a counter-insurgency tool. So they explicitly called the program as a counter-insurgency, and they explicitly they organized marches, protests, banners, slogans to demand more provisions for the rural poor. It might seem as conflictual to some extent, but quite contrary, I think this is what the movement exactly needed to protect and increase its grassroots power and its to keep its relationship with the movement's base, the rural poor. And in the research, I ran many robustness checks for the quantitative models. I changed person day version of the NREGA variable to expenditure, tested for violent and non-violent, urban and rural Naxalite events separately. And also I changed the time lag of the instrumental variable. And at the end, I observed that the positive coefficient is robust for different model specifications. And for the second hypothesis, I also ran another instrumental variable analysis, which again validates the findings in the baseline. I also ran a series of analysis to show the impact of SEZs on the NREGA is robust, and looked at reverse relationship, used expenditure version of the NREGA variable, and that also validates the findings in the baseline. So the government employed this substitution strategy, which is a specific form of political containment, and however, this strategy was failed because of Naxalites' right-based discourse on the NREGA, by framing the program as a collective action demand. And the Naxalites transformed the contention phase from a political containment or substitution to a concession. So they changed the slope of MP nexus from DS to DC, which means the policy now increases future mobilization of the movements. Here are some unique things that I contributed to the literature in this research: Mobilization-Policy Nexus. I used GLOCON database for the first time. Also my research considers the Naxalites as a social movement in a quantitative manner, unlike previous research. And I empirically controlled for the reverse causality problem and looked for the two directions of the contention. Which means I consider contention in as a dynamic interplay between two sides actors. The mobilization of the poor is not just exposed to the decision of the authorities, but produce their own strategies and have its own capacity to reverse those strategies. The conclusion is twofold. The political containment strategy is not only directed at the unrest, but also at the material grievances of the poor, as we saw in the case of SEZ projects and land dispossessions. And even radical movements have a collective agency. They develop successful counter strategies to reverse those governmental efforts. And they are not just single body violent terrorist blocks. There is this problem of mobilization, as always. I also have some limitations, as you see. Future research might focus on more recent BJP-led era. I couldn't cover the state-level variation between different political blocs in the former politics of India. Also, probably there are some differences among different factions of the Naxalites, probably, and which again I couldn't cover in this research. And finally, the most important task, in my opinion, I myself really like to do this in the upcoming years, if possible. It is quantifying this framing flexibility or a demanding data. Now, in the GLOCON database, we can measure the range and magnitude of movement mobilization, but usually we don't know what the movement claims for, what that protest is, so what that protest demands. So a quantitative analysis of this movement's demanding practices looks very important for future research. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And now I am opening the floor for questions and comments. So any questions from the floor? And also I'm checking our participants on Zoom as well. For our participants on Zoom, if you have any questions, please, go ahead. You can raise your hand and
I can ask something.
Mm-hmm.
You remind me of what Devlet Bahçeli said once. In 2010 or something, I think other parties didn't know how to deal with that policy of the AKP. And they were looking at the individuals who are taking social assistance from the government as kind of traitors who sell their votes to the government. But Devlet Bahçeli said, "Al paketi vur tokadı," kind of discourse he
I see.
advanced. And I think how people feel is very related with the discourse created by the politicians. So if you are living in a country where the rebel groups or the other parties are talking about the social assistance program in a bad way, I mean, kind of state is buying the votes of the public, kind of. That I think has a bad effect also, I mean, on parties, also on the individuals, citizens. And I wonder if you see any study looking for the how people feel about these strategies of the rebel groups. I mean, they are framing the social assistance program in a new way. So maybe you began to think about social assistance program in a different way also. For example, you may look at it as okay, I am a low life, I am taking this assistance and I'm that person, or you can think that that's my historical right to take this. Also, they are stealing this money from us and we should take all these money back kind of discourse.
Yeah, I think it's I think the answer can be like that. So yeah, there is a discourse among people But in my research, I saw that that discourse can be changeable. So it's not a static discourse. For example, when we look at the Brazilian case, it is totally different from the Indian case. In the NREGA provision, so the studies analyzing that similar relationship for the Brazilian case often said that the Bolsa Familia program dictated a temporality for the individuals, and so taking that assistance was a quite this credibility for the beneficiaries. But in the Indian case, we see the quite opposite, and people not only for Naxalite movements, but people from different also mobilizations, different social movements ask for, so they see that provision as their own demand. But this might be an outcome of another process. And I try to explain that process, how this changed, how their perception on the program changed. And there are some other reasons, by the way. So probably the difference between the programs. So NREGA provides much more discussion on the for the negotiation of individuals with the government. So there are much rooms for the NREGA program. Both in Bolsa Familia, it is conditional cash transfer program. In also Yeşil Kart program, we have a similar structure. But in the NREGA, it is employment based, and local level negotiation is quite powerful. It is not some officials coming your home and decide whether you are deserving or not. Quite opposite. In Gram Panchayats, local level administrations, people discuss on that need, and they just decide the demand, the actual demand, and then report that to state level administrations. But in the official documents, the difference between demands and the actual distributed the numbers are very close to each other. So when you look at the official database of NREGA, you see the demand column and the difference between the demand column and the actual NREGA provisions distributed. That column are quite similar to each other, but anthropological research say quite opposite. That's not the case. So probably they are manipulating those numbers at the state level. But still, there are rooms for demanding practices for the NREGA program. So there are some other structural reasons probably causing that dynamics, but I prefer to focus on much more the movement-based, mobilizational dynamics, the dynamic aspect of that discourse that you asked. Was it that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one. Thank you very much. Well, this was really good. I have one suggestion, one question. So you can incorporate another case with a temporal comparison within the case. I'm talking about the Turkish case. So the Kurdish movement for the last 2 decades, almost in the first half of, in the last 3 decades, I would say. In the first 1/2, they negated social assistance as a colonial strategy, but later on they turned to not demand, but they started to provide their own social assistance programs, especially to municipalities and certain NGOs. And so what would be the effect of this change in strategy? Because government strategy of providing more and more social assistance to Kurds remained almost constant as far as we know. But the movement's counter response has changed. So what would be the effect of this on movement's level of mobilization or demobilization? So this can be a case. And my question is, so if you are hired as an external advisor to a social movement, what would you recommend them? So
Advisor for what?
advisor by a social movement. So
Okay.
they come to you and ask what we should do.
Sounds great.
The government not paying you, but just asking you. But they ask you, so what we should do? So the government is trying to buy off our people, what we should do. But the more difficult question is,
Yes.
if in the very unlikely case of the Indian government body coming you and asking what we should do, so we try to buy them off, but they backfired. So shall we kill them? So what would be our response then? And what would be your suggestion to Modi?
Yeah. Can I just skip that part and go through social movements? Let me start with the social movement part, because I think the other side is quite obvious. So it is possible to buy some, and we see that from old classical thesis of from the classical thesis of Piven Clover. So there are always room for political containment for the governments. But I think the major contribution of this research can be understood in social movement aspect. So if a generic thing to think on a generic phrase might be like that, if it is important for the potential adherences, then attach some importance to that policy. That might be an important interpretation. Because especially for if on a scale from left to right, to go to declare I am more leftist, social movements or some leftist movements sometimes reject that kind of practical issues, as we saw in the case of Bolsa Familia. So the MST organizers, so single demand movements have been perceived much more powerful than movements with various demands. So if probably being a single demand movement provided much more historical legacy for the MSD. But we see here, especially after the 2000s, after the rise of social assistance programs and probably the increasing numbers of governmental tools and techniques to demobilize social movements, probably that single demand structure do not still work, so or do not outperform at least. That was my first interpretation of these findings for a social movement. That might be. And in more practically, I think, for example, in Turkey, we have too many that kind of issues. For example, if I am close with a student organization, before government forgiving the KYK debts, I should ask it for the students, because probably if KYK credits and they so we should repay the amount after we got job something, and there is this negotiation. Some parties say that we will delete the interests, and some others say we will delete all of those, etc. And sometimes student groups raise that demand, so you should delete all of those. And as a social, so to gain new mobilization advantages, I think the best way is to rise that demand before government gives that policy, that so before government forgive those debts, we should rise our own demand to mobilize potential individuals. I mean,
So Pınar Kahya has a question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation.
Pınar, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm a PhD candidate, so my research is about India too, but I have political economy background, so my question is a bit related with that. I want to ask, how do you interpret the UPA government in the state level? I mean that, how do you see, in quotation, failure of UPA? For some, I know that it's kind of inclusive neoliberalism, but at the end, it's failed, and the process paved the way for the rule of the BJP. So how do you interpret the UPA in the state level and this kind of social welfare programs? Thank you.
I thank you for the question. And I didn't, unfortunately, specifically worked on the decline of UPA. I read too many things for that while trying to understand the dynamics in rural dynamics in that process. And if I'm not mistaken, so in my opinion, so I'm not an expert for that question, but I can just briefly say that the main reason that replaced the government, especially for local level governments, to change that governments from UPA to BJP, might be a result of long-term historical mobilization of BJP or far-right groups in the rural. So that might be quite interesting for me, because we also have some that kind of far-right groups, but whenever I see and read something about the Naxalite movement's fight against landowner allies, there was another group, a counter movement, and which is, I mean, in the middle of 20th century. So that might be an important reason, other than that welfare changing in the welfare structures. But as I said, I didn't specifically work on the decline of UPA, so I'm not much familiar with the general economy, the change in the political economy from UPA to BJP. But maybe Burak Hocam, you are also expert in political economy of India. You may if you want to.
We need to make a separate discussion on these issues in the future, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pınar. Akap has a question.
Yeah, I have a very short question. I follow your research very closely. The first thing I wanted to ask was, so did the government conceive this scheme separately for this problem, or was it like solve the larger problems, like a pan-Indian thing? Like a pan-Indian problem, like there are so many issues, the lower caste, suppressed groups, women, or was it, specifically aimed at these social mobilizations? And second thing is, like, but why was it a failure? Like, was it a failure because of the number of days, or was it a failure because of the inherent, structure in which it operated? Because there were accusations that, that it's a system in which you give 5 rupees and the receiver at the end gets 1 rupee. So you are distributing so much wealth, but the middleman in between, the majority chunk, the 80% gets somewhere, somewhere lost. So why was it a failure from their end? And also, I forgot the timeline of your research, because currently this government, they also have their own. I mean, they have on and off, issue with this NREGA, and they also have a wider social mobilization programs, social assistance programs, sorry, like in terms of food rationing and other things. So I was looking at it. I mean, I didn't follow your timeline of the research.
My empirical model starts with 2006 to 2014, and that was the empirical research. But
your first question was, so yeah, the NREGA is not, I think, the main motivation behind that, not only in India, we can also say for all other social assistance programs. There are structural determinants also. Probably the poverty level, so the neoliberal economic policy, political economy, and the increasing social need. There are too many reasons, structural reasons, for governments to implement those policies. Also in India, probably we have too many reasons. We can find that reasons, but literature largely focus on that kind of determinants, and political dynamics are very rarely discussed by previous scholars. And also, yeah, so they really matter. But I think in the distribution process, more likely that political dimensions should be considered, not the initiation, but the distribution level, I think. And also among political dynamics, some scholars worked on electoral dynamics and still ignoring social movement-based or contentious political dynamics in that sense. And your second question, can you remind me also?
Yeah, about the failure of, like, why was it seen as a failure? Was it because the number, they wanted the number of days to be increased, or was it like this model is not working? The inherent failure in this model was operating?
The failure of the government, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the most of demands, I can classify those demands. So some of, so yeah, I can say three different demand fields. I can, first, they wanted to increase the number of days from 100 to different numbers, from region to region. Sometimes they say 180. Sometimes they say 365, 1 year employment. And but I think these numbers change from district to districts, from organization to organization, faction to faction, or let's say. And the second, they said you should increase the numbers, the wage levels, I mean. So it provides a minimum wage level in public works, but still, for some cases, people, rural poor, couldn't get that level because they couldn't complete the 100 days. That's why they didn't take that whole money. So I saw that kind of protests. And finally, as we have rooms for discretion, we also have many rooms for corruption. So movement fight or organized march against corruption done by other groups. So that was, I think, the third dimension raised by the movement. So, but the main failure that I define in my paper is mobilization, further mobilization of the movement. So I think, so still, if movement demobilized, then we can say that this strategy was successful for the government side. But under these conditions, movement gained new mobilization advantages by detecting that field, each of that field, which was very important for the rural poor. I think the main success and the main failure of the government lies under this conflict between two sides.
Thank you. So Deniz, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, Fuat. It is really thought-provoking. I have two questions in my mind, but I suspect that two of them looks for an additional variable that you do not contain in your research, and then it might be ridiculous to address on that level. But my first question is about the state capacity. I mean, comparing to Brazil and India, what if the Brazilian case is a much more successive and composite social assistance program at the very initiation compared to India? I mean, that might be a factor that demobilized the movement in Brazil. If the state capacity was much more stronger compared to India, that might be an additional factor, regardless of the organizational capacity of the Naxalites. And my second question is that, again, I mean, I will raise a question on an external variable, but I mean, comparing to, I'm not familiar with Brazilian case, but comparing to Kurdish and the Naxalites, I mean, the cross-cutting commonality is that each of these movements still hold a armed fraction, right, in its base. So, I mean, rather than framing the demands, I mean, the successive capability of framing demands on a certain policy, how about their impact on resolving that armed militancy in terms of mobilization and so on? Yeah, thanks.
I see. So, sizin mikrofonu hocam şey yapayım mı? So for the first question, I think it's so two questions were I think very important and implies some limitations in my research as well. So for the first one, in the most similar systems design structure of my research, I say that yes, we found a difference between two cases, and I see there is this independent variable, the framing difference between the two cases. The Naxalite movements framed that policy, the social assistance, as a collective action demand, but the MST couldn't or didn't. Then, to show the reasons behind, and not in this presentation, but in my doctoral dissertation, to clarify the reasons for demanding difference, I count that state capacity differentiations between the two contexts. In the Indian case, there are much more room for so there are different powers that have their own state capacity. States are much powerful than Brazilian states, and in Brazil, so they both have federal systems, state governments, but in India, states are much more power than compared to the Brazilian case. But also there are much more violent movements in India, while it's not the same thing for Brazilian case. So there are that kind of differences. So your question is very rightfully directed to my doctoral dissertation. But still, I think we can find some rooms to negotiate, to associate that state capacity differentiation with the difference between movements, structures, and mobilizational dynamics, I think. But I need to work on that much more than I did. And second, the impact of armed militancy. Yes, I think there might be some impacts. But I think this is not directly about using arms. So MST also follows some violent tactics. They're occupying lands, and if necessary, they are sometimes not too much, but very small or basic levels of violence, we can say, for MST. but I think ideological radicalism is much more important than this. So Naxalite, MST, I think the main difference between the MST and Naxalite is not for one is using armed militancy and the other one is not. The main difference, I think, is about ideological radicalism. And that provides, I think, having a more revolutionary line, I think, provided Naxalites to build new discourses on different politics, different political dimensions, different political factors, and different policies. So in my opinion, it's not about using directly arms, but being able to employ different ideological tools instead of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I thank you.
Other questions? I have one question. So you said, the primary purpose of NREGA program was to contain Maoist unrest, but in relation to that, also to continue SEZ projects, right? So these two are sort of quite related objectives of the program. So how did the program, affect the SEZ projects? Because you say it backfired to some extent, in terms of in terms of containing Maoist unrest. It couldn't contain that much because Maoists started to frame it as a sort of social movement demand. Yes, that's a very interesting, important finding. But how about the progress of SEZ?
After the program's implementation?
Yeah.
So,
have you looked at it, or
yeah,
do you plan to look at it?
I control the reverse relationships, so the impact of the NREGA on SEZs and also the impact of SEZs on NREGA projects. But I didn't work on the qualitative mechanisms behind. So empirically, I showed that there is positive correlation between the number of SEZ areas and the NREGA provisions. So if there is an SEZ, if there is the NREGA provision, then government send more, approve more SEZ, or let's say become more prone to accept, approve notifications of the SEZ projects. So empirically, I showed that one of my figures, one of coefficients just says that, but the mechanism I suggest is this substitution mechanism. So government did this because they perceived these two things to substitute each other. It employs the NREGA, then accepting the SEZ projects and increasing number of land dispossessions become easier task for the government. And so for the sake of class-based allies of the government, also market-based allies and some development projects. And it is also helpful for export-oriented growth model followed by the government. So that was my explanation and suggestion to look for. But however, there might be some other mechanisms also. So this is not one of my hypotheses, just one of my mechanisms. So for that reason, I'm not sure about the exact answer, but my explanation was that.
Because again, if the government could continue on the SEZ front, okay, then the backfiring arguments should also be made in a more nuanced way, right? Maybe you may use, of course, this is totally wild speculation at this point. You need to do, of course, many people need to do research, but you may even frame it as a distraction, right? Naxalites keep mobilizing it, labeling the NREGA program as a movement demand and achieve some success on that front. At least they prevent the government, right, from de-radicalizing the masses, etc., etc. But if that issue wasn't enough to sort of reverse the SEZ progress, right, which is again a core demand of the Maoist movement, again, and the success and failure, arguments should be made even more in advanced phase. So I think if you look at the SEZ, progress, okay, in the red corridor, right, obviously, maybe in a more longer time frame, not just like the UPA government era, but a bit longer time frame. I think you may find even more interesting, I think, findings, more interesting, conclusions. But anyway, thank you. If there is no other question, so we can, end our seminar. And thank you very much for, Fuat, for making this extremely interesting and informative presentation. And I want to thank our participants in this room and also our participants from the Zoom for asking quite interesting, insightful questions. Thank you and have a good day.